Hi everyone. We'll be discussing audit documentation essay 230 today, which is also chapter number 6 of the CA inter portion. Now, so I've got my own notes over here if you see the screen, and these notes have been prepared from the CA inter portion, the chapter number 6 that is in the CA inter syllabus, and also I've just referenced essay 230, also the bare essay 230 from the standards on auditing. And what I've done is I've also taken off some examples from therein. The language is simplified in places, but I've also retained all the important terminology because the terminology is important. You can't really eliminate all the terminology and then study audit because the terminology also, a few words are really important. So I've retained those also if you see in the notes. Now, first of all, I've got a physical copy also of the notes in front of me just so it's easier for me. Now, first of all, the very purpose of any audit, the very objective of any audit, the eventual objective of any audit is to issue the audit report. You're doing all of the work, you're doing all your audit procedures, your audit planning, your audit testing, all of it to eventually be able to issue the audit report. And the company is really interested in getting the audit report and getting an unqualified, a clean audit report. And basically, all the work that you do, all the procedures that you do, all the audit evidence that you gather, and through the work that you do and through the audit evidence that you gather, the conclusions that you reached, that all of that needs to be documented. And how that is documented is dictated by this standard, essay number 230. Now, so basically, your audit documentation contains the entire life cycle of how the conclusions were reached, how the audit conclusion was reached. If you've given a clean opinion, if you've concluded that the financial statements show a true and fair review, how did you reach that conclusion? The entire process of how you reach that conclusion should be contained within your audit file, within your audit working papers. And that is the essence of this standard. Now, the first thing, why is audit documentation important? Now, why is audit documentation important? I just want to go through an example first. For example, you've done an entire audit and tomorrow there is some kind of irregularity that is been detected in the company's financial statements. Let's say there is a web article, there is a public article about some kind of irregularity or some kind of possible fraud that could have occurred within the company. So now, these days, the first anything happens, the auditors are first kind of questioned, like, what was the auditor doing? Why did the auditor not pick up the fraud? Or why did the auditor not pick up the irregularity? Now, for you to be able to justify that you've done your work correctly and that you've done all that was required as per the standards, how are you going to demonstrate that? It is only through your audit documentation that you will be able to demonstrate that you have done the work that was sufficient. You have done the requisite sampling that was required. You have tested the samples. You have tested the controls. You have gathered all the audit evidence that you feel was sufficient and appropriate, and accordingly you've reached your audit conclusion. So if your audit file is able to demonstrate that, then there is no problem for you. And this is why audit documentation is important. This is one of the primary reasons why audit documentation is extremely important. So if you read this, without proper documentation, an audit has no legs to stand upon. It is audit documentation which serves as a record of audit work performed. He was also mulling over that. In fact, audit documentation throws up a sort of protective shield around auditors. It's very important. A protective shield is thrown around auditors, because if something happens tomorrow, if something untoward happens within the company, something wrong happens, your audit documentation is going to save you. Now, if an auditor plans and performs his work professionally, his working papers will come to his rescue in case such a situation arises. Conclusions reached by him can be traced to his working papers. So this is one of the main reasons why audit documentation is extremely important. Now, the next paragraph, essay 230, audit documentation, deals with the auditor's responsibilities for preparation of audit documentation Audit documentation is also referred to as working papers or work papers. So you see these words, working papers and work papers, these are used interchangeably with audit documentation. In practically, you also call it as you use it as a short form WP. So for example, you'll have a cash bank WP, which is a cash bank work paper, or you have like a property, plant and equipment WP, which is a property, plant and equipment work paper. So you can, so audit documentation could be called working papers, could be called work papers, could be just called WP as in short form. The next part, definition of audit documentation. Now, before we go to the definition of audit documentation, I just wanted to look at the table that's there below, where you see three words written: audit procedures, audit evidence, and conclusions. So what is audit procedures? Audit procedures is basically what the auditor did during the course of the audit. Audit evidence is what all he has gathered during the course of the audit, and conclusions is basically what he has inferred from the procedures that he has done and the evidence he has gathered. What are his thoughts about it? What are the conclusions he has reached? So these are the three steps that formulate the definition of audit documentation. So we'll just go to read the lines written above. Audit documentation refers to the record of audit procedures performed, relevant audit evidence obtained, and the conclusions the auditor reached. So very important three words here: audit procedures performed, record of that, the relevant audit evidence obtained, and conclusions that the auditor reached. I've just given you in simple words also. FIU is for your understanding. Record of everything the auditor did, the information they found, and their final thoughts on it. Record of everything that the auditor did, that is your audit procedures, the information they found, that is your audit evidence, and their final thoughts on it, that is your conclusions that you have drawn from the audit evidence and from the audit procedures that you performed during the course of your audit. Now, the next part, objectives of the auditor. What is an auditor's objective when he is preparing his audit documentation? So there are two aspects to this question, to this concept. The objective of the auditor is to prepare audit documentation that provides a sufficient and appropriate record of the basis for the auditor's report. See, the ultimate end goal of any audit is to issue the auditor's report. And your entire audit documentation is prepared so that you have a sufficient basis, a proper and appropriate basis to issue the auditor's report with the conclusion that you have given. Let's say you've given an unqualified, a qualified, an adverse, a disclaimer, whatever kind of conclusion you've given. Your audit documentation has to be able to demonstrate the basis for that conclusion. So the main objective of preparing audit documentation is such that it provides a sufficient and appropriate record for the basis of the auditor's report. And also, second, it serves as evidence that the audit was planned and performed in accordance with the essays and applicable legal and regulatory requirements. Now, essays, you have to comply with all the standards in auditing if you are, performing any audit. Now, what is applicable legal and regulatory requirements here? So, in legal and regulatory requirements, you could have, for instance, Companies Act, you could have your Indian accounting standards, the financial reporting framework. You could have Schedule 3, which prescribes the format for the preparation of the financial statements. You could have income tax for computation, for the tax computation, the provision for tax. Then you could have your GST Act, you could have Provident Fund, you could have professional tax, you could have Payment of Gratuity Act for computation of gratuity provision. So you could have a lot of things. You could also have SEBI LODR in case of listed companies. If you're doing audit of a listed company, you will also have to check that the company has complied with the provisions of the SEBI LODR Act. So your objective of the auditor is to prepare audit documentation that provides a sufficient and appropriate record of the basis for the auditor's report and evidence that the audit was planned and performed in accordance with the essays and also with the applicable legal and regulatory requirements. Now, the next question on nature and purpose of audit documentation. So, nature of audit documentation, if you see, it's the same two objectives that are given above. Those are kind of framed differently, and there are two E's here. There are two evidences here. If you see the first and the second point, and both have highlighted the word evidence. So, you need to remember that the nature of audit documentation is such that it provides evidence. See, it is like, how does this work? During your audit, to perform your audit and to to opine on an audit, to opine on the financial statements and to give an audit report, you collect a lot of audit evidence through the course of your audit. Throughout the course of your audit, you're collecting audit evidence so as to enable you to issue an opinion on the financial statements. But your entire audit file itself, your entire audit documentation itself serves as an audit evidence of the work you've performed. Whatever work you've performed, the evidence that you've performed, the work that you have done. How does anyone verify that? It is only through your audit documentation that one will be able to verify and to check the work that you've performed. So audit documentation itself is kind of an evidence of the audit work you've performed. Okay. Also, there's this quote that goes, work not documented is work not done. So even if you claim that you've done a lot of work, but if it's not put down on paper, if it's not there in your audit documentation, it does not form a part of your audit file, you cannot claim you've done it. It has to be documented. It has to be there within your audit file. It's very strict. And if the regulators look at your file, if there's an internal inspection, if it's not documented, it is not done. And essentially, that is why it is very important that whatever work you are doing, you make sure that each part of it is documented within your audit file. Okay. The next thing now, audit documentation that meets SA 230 requirements provides the following. First, evidence of the auditor's basis for a conclusion about the achievement of the overall objectives of the auditor. So you see, it's kind of the first point only of the objectives, that the audit documentation provides evidence of the auditor's basis for a conclusion about the achievement of the overall objectives of the auditor. And second, evidence that the audit was planned and performed in accordance with the SAs and applicable legal and regulatory requirements. So you can study both of these questions together. They have two parts: basis for the auditor's report, conclusion for the auditor's report, and second, it was planned and performed in accordance with the standards and the applicable legal and regulatory framework. The next part now, purpose of audit. This is an important question. Now, audit documentation serves several purposes. First of all, it assists the engagement team to plan and perform the audit. Now, if you see the audit documentation, it kind of gives a structure. When you're doing your audit documentation, it helps you to allocate the resources for the engagement. Any engagement, let's say you get an engagement for an ITC audit, hypothetically, you need to decide who will be the engagement partner, who will be the engagement manager, who will be the engagement staff. You need to plan your resources. Then you need to do budgeting. You need to budget how many hours you will spend on the audit, the total hours first of all, and then individually each resource will spend how much time of each resource is required for the engagement. You will also prepare the audit plan, a brief plan of, at which stage you're going to do what, and the timelines also. So documentation helps to just plan and perform the audit. This is one of the purposes of audit documentation. Second, it assists the engagement team members who are responsible for supervision to direct and supervise the audit work and to discharge their review responsibilities. Now, for a reviewer to be able to review, now first of all, audit is always a two-step procedure. You will always have a maker and you will have a checker. It's not just that one person will go on preparing everything and then the audit file is done and the engagement partner will sign the audit report. It doesn't happen like that. You will always have a checker also who will check all the work that has been done by the maker. And there could be different for the work that isn't prepared by, let's say, a paid assistant, that would be maybe checked by the manager, or if some work has been performed by the article assistant, maybe that's reviewed by the paid assistant. By paid assistant, I mean a qualified chartered accountant. And let's say work performed by the engagement manager could be reviewed by the engagement partners. You will always have a maker checker kind of control at each step in the audit. Now, for any of the audit team members who have supervisory responsibilities, who have review responsibilities, the audit documentation is going to help them to be able to discharge their review responsibilities, because they can look at the audit documentation, they can see what work has been done by the maker, by the preparer, and then check that, okay, this, whatever work has been done is appropriate, or if it's not appropriate, they can give their review comments and they can discuss with the preparer what else needs to be done or how things need to be improved. So audit documentation also helps supervisors to carry out their review responsibilities. The third point, it enables the engagement team to be accountable for its work. So this is more in the sense like if there is no audit documentation, you will never know who performed what work. You will never know which team member performed what work. What did the entire audit team as a whole perform? What work did it do? So, the audit documentation is an evidence of the work performed by the audit team. So that's why it enables the engagement team to be accountable for its work. Tomorrow, if there's insufficient work, you can pin up responsibility on them, or you can tell them, the engagement partner feels the work is not performed adequately. He can ask them to do more, to do more work. So that is why it's important. Audit documentation serves this purpose also. Fourth, retaining a record of matters of continuing significance to future audits. Again, a very important point. Let's say, you're appointed as an auditor for a 5-year term. Now, in the first year, the audit engagement team will come do all of their work and archive their audit file. In the second year, you're not going to have the entire audit inquiries, discussions, and all of that, which was done in the first year of the audit. You're not going to do all of that again. You will go back to your last year audit file and see what work they have performed, and whatever incremental work is required, that you will be doing. By incremental, I mean you will obviously test all of the balances, your P&L accounts, your disclosures, everything for the current year. But a lot of the processes, let's say you have a process understanding that has been done in the prior year, and if there is no change in the process in the current year, you will not again go to the client, to the management, to understand the entire process again. You can refer back your previous year work papers, and also how things have been done, how certain financial statement balances have been checked, how has the revenue been checked. Your previous year work papers help a lot. You don't have to again think from scratch. You don't have to start from scratch. There is already a base. So audit documentation also serves as a record of matters of continuing significance to future audits. Next, the fifth and sixth point are actually, they go hand in hand. The fifth point is it helps to do internal inspections, like audit firms. Within the firms, you'll have internal quality inspections where, let's say, one engagement partner will check the work of another engagement partner's team, and vice versa this works. So it enables internal inspections. And the sixth point is it also enables external inspections as per the applicable legal, regulatory, other requirements. So you've got 6 points for audit purposes, for audit documentation purposes. The next question is, you've got one illustration which I've taken from the CA Inter book. It says a new team member of the auditors of Extremely Vibrant Limited was of the view that audit documentation does not help in planning the audit of any company. Explain whether audit documentation has any relation with regard to planning the audit of a company. So this statement is incorrect, because the very first purpose that we studied was it assists the engagement team to plan and perform the audit. So the statement made by the new team member is incorrect. Now, what is the solution written here? Audit documentation helps in planning the audit of a company in a proper manner, and also helps in conducting the audit of a company in a more effective way. Now, the next part, form, content, and extent of audit documentation. Now we need to understand first of all these three words actually: form, content, and extent. Form, in very simple terms, simple words, means how, content would be what, and extent would be how much. Form is, if you see the next line again for your understanding, form is physical or electronic format. Should the audit documentation be in physical paper? Should I write down everything by hand on a physical paper, or should it be in electronic format? Should it be more of Excel spreadsheets or Word documents, PowerPoint presentations? What is the format of the audit documentation? The content is as to what all forms part of the documentation: the audit program, the inquiries, the testing procedures, correspondences reviewed, meeting minutes reviewed. So what forms part of the audit documentation? That is your content. And extent is how much, the amount of details required. So form is Form is what, so form is how, content is what, and extent is how much. Now, so the first paragraph within the brackets where I've put for your understanding, that is not a part of the standard, that I've just put for understanding purpose. Now the next paragraph, the auditor should prepare audit documentation that is sufficient to enable an experienced auditor. This word is very important. I've highlighted it here. Experienced auditor. It is not for a new auditor, an inexperienced auditor. It is for an experienced auditor. You are preparing your audit documentation that you've done should be such that an experienced auditor is able to understand it. You're not expecting an inexperienced auditor to be able to understand it. Very important here. Now, the auditor should prepare audit documentation that is sufficient to enable an experienced auditor having no previous connection with the audit. Very important, he has no previous connection with the audit. So experienced auditor, even if he has no previous connection with the audit, he should be able to understand your entire work that you've done and how you've reached the conclusion in the audit report that you've issued. So such should be the robustness of your audit documentation. So what should he be able to understand? First, the nature, timing, and extent of the audit procedures performed. Then the results of the audit. So nature, timing, and extent of the audit procedures performed is basically what was done during the audit. Second, the results of the audit procedures performed and the evidence obtained basically is what came out of the audit procedures that you performed. And third is significant matters arising during the audit and the conclusions reached and significant professional judgments made in reaching those conclusions. So basically, the key areas also need to be documented in your audit file. So you've got the nature, timing, and extent, which is what procedures were performed, the results of the audit procedures performed, and the evidence obtained. So what came out of the work that you did, and the significant matters arising during the audit and the conclusions reached, and significant professional judgments made in reaching those conclusions. So on significant matters and significant professional judgment, on both of these you've got subsequent questions. These are very important terms actually, significant matters and significant professional judgment. So you'll see separate questions on it later in the chapter. Now, in documenting the nature, timing, and extent, NTE's nature, timing, extent of such audit procedures performed, the auditor shall record, number one, the identifying characteristics of the specific items or matters tested. So this is essentially, we're talking about this audit sampling over here. It's very important. Like, let's say you've taken revenue or you've taken expenses for testing. How are you doing your audit sampling? Are you going to test 100% of the population, or are you going to test specific items out of the population, like a sample of the population? How do you determine your sample? Do you do a random sampling, a simple random sampling where you just pick up 10 samples at random or 20 samples at random? Or do you do some kind of stratified sampling where you kind of take samples from each different stream of revenue? If there are 10 streams in the revenue section, you take out, let's say, 2 samples from each stream of revenue. Or you do a judgment based sampling where you take up the larger balance items, the larger number items, you take up those and some random items. So basically, whatever audit sampling you are doing, you have to justify why do you feel that audit sampling is appropriate, and what are the samples that you've taken out. You need to bring that out in your audit documentation. The second and third point is basically details of the preparer and the date the preparer made the work, and third is details of the checker and the date the checker checked the work and the extent of such review. Very important. If you see the third point, it also says who reviewed the audit work performed and the date and extent of such review. Very important, extent of such review, because let's say now you have your expenses area in your financial statements, and let's say the person who's preparing the expenses work paper decides to test 20 samples of expenses. So he calls for 20 invoices and 20 supporting documents for those expenses. Let's say there are agreements and all. So he calls for those supporting documents for those expenses. And He will check, he will vouch all of those. He will put in all the details of what he has checked from the invoices and the supporting documents. He will bring it onto his work paper. Now, what is the checker going to check? Is the checker checking each of the 20 items? Is he opening each and every document that the preparer has checked while preparing the work paper? Is he going to go into every small detail that the preparer has done? Which might not be actually possible, and that the entire point might get, the point of checking might get diluted if you sit to check everything. So that is why you need to document the extent of such review, like while reviewing, what have you actually checked in the preparer's work. So that is also a very important point that needs to be documented by the reviewer. Next, the auditor shall document discussions of significant matters with management, those charged with governance, TCWG, and others, including the nature of the significant matters discussed and when and with whom the discussions took place. So, if you see this point is similar to the third point over here. Oh, one sec. This paragraph, the auditor shall document discussions of significant matters with management. That is similar to the third point over here as to the significant matters arising during the audit and the conclusions reached. So basically, you need to document that, and you also need to document when you made those discussions, like what was the date of the discussions and with whom the discussion took place. Like, let's say if it was the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer, or you had some discussion with the CEO, or you had some discussion with the finance controller, or the operations head, or the compliance head, or the risk head, and the date when that discussion took place, those details also need to be documented in your work papers. The next paragraph. If the auditor identified information that is inconsistent with the auditor's conclusion regarding a significant matter, the auditor shall document how the auditor addressed the inconsistency. This is a very important point. Let's say you've reached a conclusion about a particular account balance in your financial statements, and later you come across some information that is contradictory to the conclusion that you've drawn. It makes you rethink that, okay, I've drawn a favorable conclusion, but this inconsistency is making me question if the favorable conclusion that I've drawn earlier, is that correct or not. So if there is any such kind of inconsistency that you come across during your audit, you also need to document the inconsistency first of all, and how have you addressed that inconsistency. And after that inconsistency you came across, did you change your conclusion? Did you retain the same conclusion? You did not change it. Whatever you've done and why you've kept it the way it is, or why have you changed it, that needs to come out. That's very important. So if you see the example which I put for your understanding, let's say you've concluded that the property, plant, equipment account balance is fairly stated, but later upon discussion with the internal auditor, they tell you certain PPE, certain property, plant, equipment were not traceable during physical verification. So basically there could be some malfeasance of physical property, plant, equipment, or somebody has stolen something, those things could be possible. So such contradictory information is an inconsistency with the conclusion, and the auditor will need to document how he has addressed this in his work papers. Maybe let's say if the internal auditor did not find five property plant, five air conditioners, for example, when he was doing the physical verification, and those did not come across in your sample. But now that you've got that information, you'll have to check. Maybe you say that, okay, those five ACs were not very material, so it does not impact my overall conclusion. But, or the other case could be, you still go to management and ask them why these five ACs were missing, and you will also try to check could this extend to more samples? Could there be more such assets that are actually missing or not available but are still included in the property, plant, equipment? So the process of how you are checking this information that is inconsistent with your earlier drawn conclusion needs to be documented within your work paper. It's basically, just to reiterate, it's basically you've drawn a conclusion earlier, and now you've come across some information which is an inconsistency. So you need to document how you have addressed this inconsistency in your work papers.